Thank you very much for welcoming me to Gothenburg. It's my first time here. I hope you can understand my accent. I'm from Northern Ireland, but actually also, like many of the speakers today, I live in Belgium. So I'm not sure why, but many drug policy people working in Belgium. But we'll all be having interesting conversations on the flight on the way home, I'm sure. So I'm Fay. I'm based with an organization called EURAD. We're a drug policy organization, and we're based in Brussels. Most of our members are working either on drug policy, on drug prevention. We have some academics. And many of our organizations actually work on rehabilitation. So on our board, we have former drug users and people who run like social reintegration services for drug users to come back into employment, to receive training, to get housing, and also relationship advice. So we are a bit of a mixed bag. I'm also the vice chair of the EU Civil Society Forum on Drugs, which is a forum where many NGOs come to have an exchange with the European Union institutions. And we are also active on the UN drug policy. Within our organization, our work is very much aligned to the work of the EU institutions. And so when I heard about this conference, I discussed with people from the European Commission, like what would they talk about if they were invited to a conference with this title on environmental damage? Because actually, environmental damage does not feature in the EU drug strategy. And so they actually told me the two aspects that I already wanted to talk to you about. Which was actually what we can learn from wastewater analysis, which is not a really favorite subject of many people to talk about the sewage systems, but it's actually quite interesting. And secondly, I felt it was very important to touch on the environmental aspect of drug production outside of Europe, because I think that is where much of the environmental impact is actually felt. So in drug-producing countries, for example, in Latin America. So I wanted to make sure we talked about that. So, as I said before, I'm not an expert, I'm not a technical person on wastewater analysis. I come very much from a public health background. So I want to talk about what we can actually learn from wastewater, from the sewage systems, in terms of drugs. So maybe like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was wastewater analysis was very much like an experimental sort of method. There were quite many per quality studies on this. For example, there could have been studies in clubs, in particularly clubbing environments, to look at, drugs in portable toilets and things like this, which has many ethical issues, perhaps. But over the last 4 years, maybe more, wastewater analysis has been really upscaled. So we're actually looking at the wastewater of entire cities. So we're not targeting small places like small clubs where there's a lot of club drug use, but we're really targeting whole cities. And in the last maybe 4 years, there have been like a bit of an explosion of studies in this area, very good quality, high quality studies. So it's now been recognized as making sort of major contribution to monitoring drug trends and giving us not just like new information, but it also like complements existing information, for example, that we have from prevalence surveys, for example. So here are two of the big studies that came out recently. One in 2012, which analyzed wastewater in 19 European cities. And this year we had one with 41 cities in 21 countries. So it's a very large scale. And from this, it was really quite interesting. From the first study, we've seen many of the Dutch cities, like some of the speakers sort of hinted at before, they were actually excluded because the load of certain drugs was so high, it couldn't be counted within the study. So like Eindhoven, for example, had to be excluded. The MDMA content in the wastewater was extremely high. And that was actually not indicative of high drug use. It was actually indicative of drug production. So wastewater analysis can tell us where drugs are being produced, where these illicit laboratories are, but then also from analyzing the metabolites of the drugs, we can see where the drugs are being consumed as well. So it can tell us where drug production takes place, where these factories are across Europe. It can also tell us where and when drug use takes place. So it can tell us the cities where it takes place. We can see quite common factors about, for example, in ports, like in Antwerp, we have very high loads of drugs coming in and that have been taken up by the local population. It's being used at higher rates of the local population there than in other places. And we can also see which days of the week the drugs are being used. So for example, we see, again with MDMA, it being used more on weekends. So you can see peaks of use on Fridays and Saturday nights. This will come through on the wastewater analysis. Whereas something like cannabis, you can see more steadily used throughout the week. Not so many differences in the prevalence. It also can detect different types of drugs that are being used, and it can detect new types of drugs that are being used. And this has become much more important as many more drugs come on the market that we call, maybe you call them legal highs, maybe you call it new psychoactive substances. But wastewater analysis can help when we have got this new trend of different types of drugs coming onto the market. It also helps us to compare data across EU countries. You know, the prevalence data sometimes is very poor to be compared. But when you have like centers of collaboration working on the wastewater analysis using kind of similar methodologies, it's much easier to compare across the different countries. And as I said, it already complements a different type of data that we had. So we have a center in Portugal. It's called the European Monitoring Center for Drugs and Drug Addiction. And they're sort of acting like they have a portal of this information on wastewater. So you can go onto the EMCDDA website and you can find, for example, this interactive tool, which can show you, for example, like where do we find cocaine in the wastewater on a weekend. So you can see here very high in Antwerp and in London. Then, for example, methamphetamine, you find this more moving across the east of Europe. And again, this is on weekends. But there are some limitations to wastewater analysis. It cannot tell us, for example, the prevalence rates. It can tell us how much is being used per 1,000 people of the population, for example, but this is very rough. You don't know how much is really being used per person. You do not know how frequently the people individually are using. And you also cannot tell the route of administration, which may be related to the harmful effects of the drugs. So it cannot be one tool on its own. It's not there to replace anything else, but it can certainly add. And I think on the enforcement side, it's even more important because it can tell us where it's being produced. And it can help to inform in enforcement action there. But it also cannot tell us anything about the demographics of the users. You cannot say for what age the people are, what social class they are. And so this information would have to, again, come from prevalence surveys. And so for the European Union, they're starting to fund some activities, some more research in this area. They set up like a network, which is called SCORE. a network of academics and laboratories to look more at this. So from a public health perspective, it's very interesting. It can help you target your prevention messages. You can see more clearly where the drugs are being used, and you can see if it confirms the other data that you have, or maybe it contrasts with some data. So it's a tool, quite new tool, which can be used. But I also wanted to take this opportunity to talk a bit more about the environmental aspects of drug production, which occur outside of Europe. And this is to do with one piece of work that we're doing on alternative development, where you're trying to replace illicit crops with licit crops, to help the people involved with drug production move into a licit trade. So drug cultivation itself is having a kind of devastating impact in South America. So here you see just, for example, one picture of one area that has been cleared for the cultivation of coca. And during the 1990s, each year they estimated to grow coca, they were clearing 80,000 football fields per year. So that's huge. And by 2005, 12 of 51 national parks, which were supposed to be like reserved, had illicit cultivation within their borders. So this is only in Colombia, of course. In terms of the processing, just like we see in Europe as well, a lot of fertilizers being used and dumped. And Colombia coca growers were using about 210 million pounds of chemical fertilizers per year. And again, a lot of this is then different effluents being dumped into the rivers, affecting the flora and fauna in these places. But also when it comes to actually trying to combat the illicit trade, there's also impact that we should recognize. When Colombia wanted to really target their illicit problem through this Plan Colombia, they developed this Plan Colombia, which had many social aspects to it. But actually, when it came to being implemented, this sort of aerial fumigation became a very dominant part of the policy, which actually wasn't reflected in the original plan. And the aerial fumigation can add to the environmental damage because it can spray also licit crops, which are growing alongside the illicit crops. So you can be destroying also, people who are not involved with the drug trade. Now, the problem with the aerial fumigation is that, if someone comes along and just fumigates the illicit crops without saying a structure in place that helps those farmers to move to a different source of income, then it's going to really be of very limited effect. So you need to be looking at how you support farmers in those areas to have an income. And so there's many studies now looking at the impact that the sort of aerial fumigation has had on local populations, especially children, because many of these farmers have then had to move to other areas where the children haven't been able to access primary education. So I remember reading a study this year, it suggested that something like 300,000 children in Colombia had been moved out of education because of the aerial fumigation. Now, whether that is true or not, I don't know, but it could be. It could be true. And so one of the issues about this is how do you actually eradicate these illicit crops once they're in an area? And so in Bolivia and Peru, they've managed to eradicate a lot through manual eradication or voluntary eradication. Working with the local communities has been quite successful. But in Colombia, you have a big problem with landmines, because these areas are very much guarded by a militia and with landmines. So it's extremely dangerous to go and to try to eradicate these crops. So it has this dimension, which is quite specific, which is not very easily overcome. So at the moment, we've been making a paper on this topic, looking at the pros and the cons of developing alternative development strategies and how you work with communities in these countries to ensure that farmers can be moved effectively into the illicit trade, that the children remain in their education. And so this is something that we've been working on this year. Probably we will, we're almost at the end of it. It's just at the review stage at the moment, so I can't tell you too much, but we will definitely have it published next year. And we've been working with Aalborg University in Denmark to do this. And so some of the recommendations that we will certainly make are around voluntary eradication, working with local communities, looking at how trade agreements, for example, have influenced illicit drug production. We've looked back at, for example, the coffee, international coffee agreements, and how when those agreements broke down, the cocaine trade went up hugely. So looking at how international and regional agricultural agreements are actually impacting on people in Latin American countries, and ensuring that people actually have got different markets that they can effectively move into, which will bring an income for their family. Because most people involved with the drug trade in these countries, they just want an income. And so when you start to look at targeting and tackling the drug problem completely, you can't really escape from issues like social inequality, and looking at how the rural poor are treated in these countries. For example, in Thailand, they had a very successful alternative development strategy, but it had many, many dimensions. So for example, one of the issues that they found was that many of the people who were involved with the drug production had not been Thai citizens. And so actually they were unregistered people working in Thailand, working on these farms. And so one issue was about how you gain these people to have citizenship in the country that they live, so that they actually can have a job, they can have social rights, they can have economic rights. And so this is one of the issues which we've looked at in this paper. And so we've looked at it in a very honest way. We've seen, like, you know, alternative development can become a bit like a buzzword. And people, sometimes when we go to UN meetings, we hear people who say, oh, alternative development doesn't work. We hear people saying, oh, alternative development is the only way forward. And the reality is that alternative development it's just a term. It really depends on the individual program that you put in place, how successful that program is. You know, it's not just like, it's just a concept. It depends how you implement it. And so we've looked at the pros and the cons of this, and how alternative development could be one strategy for overcoming the environmental impact and the social impact of drug production in those countries. So that is one very quick overview of some of the work that we've been doing in these areas. We hope that we will be able to bring this work forward next year as work towards the United Nations General Assembly special session happen. So actually, no one's discussed it today, but in 2016, there will be a review of global drug policies. And this will be held in New York. And I know already that some countries are wanting to look at issues like alternative development as part of this global review of drug policy. So for example, in Europe, Germany has been very proactive in sponsoring alternative development projects. They have spoken out quite clearly about wanting this to be a topic to be discussed at the global level. And so we would like to play a part in sort of raising some of the issues there. So this has been a bit of a mixed presentation. I hope I haven't talked too quickly, but thank you very much for your time.